The film we're going to see tonight first appeared in 1964. It was produced by the East German film studio DEFA, or Deutsche Filmaktiengesellschaft. I'm going to speak first about the tale itself as it appears in the Grimm's collection of fairy tales. Then I'll talk a little bit about the DEFA film version, and I'm also going to talk about the distribution of this film in America in 1966. So the Golden Goose appeared in the first edition of the Grimm's Fairy Tales, Volume 1, published in 1812. And the Grimms most probably obtained this from the Hassenpflug family in Kassel. The tale appears in modified form in later editions of the Grimm's fairy tales, having been influenced by a version the Grimms obtained from a different family, the von Haxthausen family from Westphalia. And both of these families, in addition to some other informants, both families contributed numerous tales to the Grimm's collection. And it's worth noting that contrary to popular conceptions, the Grimms didn't actually roam the countryside interviewing peasants and getting their tales straight from the mouths of people working in the fields. Instead, they actually obtained most of their tales from young middle-class or aristocratic women. And this is the case with the tales that they received from the Hassenpflugs and the Haxthausens, so it also applies to the Golden Goose. The Golden Goose is about a third-born son who is branded a simpleton, a blockhead, by his father and his brothers, but in fact he proves himself to be really rather clever. He's certainly more giving than his brothers too. There are several simpleton tales in the Grimm's collection, and in some of these tales indeed the simpleton is just that, he's a simpleton. But in the Golden Goose, the third brother is branded a simpleton by his family. But as I've said, he really shows himself to be fairly clever. It's really interesting in this regard to compare the first edition of this tale with later editions of the Grimm's tales, because the first line differs significantly. In the first edition, as you can see, it begins, "There once was a man with 3 sons, but the youngest was a simpleton." When we get to later editions, we have the first sentence reading, "There was once a man who had 3 sons. The youngest was called simpleton and was ridiculed and disdained and put down on every occasion." So here in these later editions, he's called simpleton, but he really isn't actually that. So the Grimms are acknowledging, and using this different version, that he really is not a simpleton. He's unfairly regarded as such. Like so many of the third-born sons and daughters in the Grimm's fairy tales, and of course also in the European fairy tale tradition as a whole, this youngest son in the tale is an underdog figure, and he has to prove himself, and he ultimately will prevail in the end. Now, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm were the 2 oldest of 6 children, so they weren't the youngest born, but the underdog motif is certainly something that they can relate to. Their father was a lawyer, and he died in 1796 at the age of 44. Jakob and Wilhelm at this point are basically preteens. Their aunt and their grandfather helped them financially and also socially, emotionally, but the death of their father nevertheless resulted in a very precarious financial and even social situation for the Grimms. And in school, Jakob and Wilhelm were acutely aware that some of their teachers and some of their peers regarded them as social inferiors. They really felt that they had to work twice as hard as their peers to prove themselves. Their mother also died 12 years after their father in 1808, and Jakob, still in his early 20s at this time, in effect became both parent and brother to his younger siblings. Their financial situation at this time became very difficult. So again, although they were not the youngest born, they're not like this third-born son in our tale, they can nevertheless really identify with the underdog theme or motif that we see in so many of the tales in their collection, and here in the Golden Goose. So turning back to our tale, the Golden Goose, the third-born son here is the only one who willingly shares his humble meal with a little old man he meets in the forest when he goes there to chop wood. And as a reward, his pancake made of water and ashes is turned into a very fine pancake, and his sour beer is turned into good wine. But the little man also tells him that his generosity will be rewarded with good luck. and instructs him to chop down a tree and look for something in the tree's roots. And our protagonist does this, and he finds a golden goose. Now, in the film, the simpleton character shares his food not with a little old gray man, as in the Grimm's tale, but with an old woman. And it's also interesting to note that in some other versions of this tale, the magic helper figure is a woman, not a man. This is true, for example, of Ludwig Bechstein's tale, Swan klebt an. Here we have a swan as the animal figure, not a goose, and that's a tale from 1845. And in The Fairy's Return, and this is a recent retelling of The Golden Goose by author Gail Carson Levine, who was also the author of Ella Enchanted, we have a fairy godmother figure as well. In the Grimm's original version, it's a little old gray man. In the Grimm's tale, by the way, and in the retellings and in this film, the golden goose is not the goose that lays the golden eggs. So if you're here for that tale, you're not going to get it tonight. Rather, this is a sticky goose. A sticky goose. And the plot will also take us to a court. See, they're all stuck together. The plot will also take us to a court in which the princess has stopped laughing. And her father, the king, has promised her hand to the first man who can make her laugh. There are a lot of forerunners to these aspects of the tale in the European fairy tale tradition. We can find variants of the golden goose in Italian, Slavic, French, Scandinavian, and English fairy tales. For example, there are many other tales in which we find an animal or an object to which certain characters literally stick or get stuck. I've mentioned a swan, sometimes it is a goose, sometimes it's a fish, sometimes it's actually an earthenware vessel like a pot. Another element in the Golden Goose that we see in other tales is the ship that sails on both water and land, though this part of the tale isn't actually in the film you're going to see. We see some typical gender portrayals in the Golden Goose as well. When the simpleton character goes to an inn at night, the innkeeper's daughters are curious about the goose, and they covet its gold feathers. The oldest daughter grabs the goose's wing when Simpleton goes off to bed, and she pays the consequences for her curiosity and vanity, as do her two sisters after her. And that has to do with the stickiness of the goose. But the next morning, the parson, the sexton, and two peasants suffer the same fate in the Grimm's tale. Meanwhile, Simpleton, again, not a simpleton, but fairly clever, he shows himself to escape this fate. It doesn't apply to him, and he's also rewarded for his good-heartedness. So rewarded for his cleverness, but also the goodness of his heart. Now, as I've mentioned, the film version that we're going to see appeared in 1964. It was produced by the East German DEFA film studio. Before I talk a little bit about the DEFA film production of fairy tales, I'd like to mention that the Grimm's tales were briefly banned by occupation forces in the aftermath of World War II. This ban was lifted in 1946. It was very brief, but the reason for the ban had to do with the perception of some that the violence in some of the tales, now so often sanitized in modern collections of the Grimm's fairy tales, but that violence had in some way contributed to the atrocities of the Nazi era. After lifting the ban, in West Germany, the Grimm's fairy tales were particularly appealing insofar as these tales often depict a hero who is able to succeed in the world on the basis of his hard work and cleverness. The plots and characters in many of these tales thus resonated with West Germany's capitalist values, and in particular with the socio-economic aspirations of the middle class. Back to East Germany, between 1946 and 1990, the DEFA film studio produced around 160 children's films. And starting in 1952 in particular, DEFA regularly produced films targeted at an audience of children. These included not only fairy tale films, and they did over 25 of those, just strictly fairy tale films, but also quite a lot of documentaries. I'd like to mention, too, that the Russian fairy tale film, The Stone Flower, that my colleague Mark Liederman showed for us at the very beginning of this series, was very influential on the DEFA film studio. And it said that that film, because it was also shown in East Germany very successfully, that film really inspired DEFA to consider producing its own fairy tale films. And the first film that they did after that success of showing The Stone Flower was a film called Das Kalte Herz. The East Germans were so interested in the fairy tale as a genre because they believed that children would be entertained by fairy tales while at the same time absorbing the moral content and socialist ideals that they wanted to imbue those fairy tales with. The East German government also viewed East Germany as a better steward of the German cultural and literary heritage than the capitalist West. They tended to change the Grimm's tales by removing religious elements as well as some of the violence in the tales. Scholar Mark Silberman has observed, typical for the fairy tale features that emerged from the East European socialist countries, DEFA's fairy tales were constructed around smart and stupid rather than good and evil characters. You'll see that in this film. And class antagonisms between the poor people and the power holders dominated the conflict situations. And we certainly see those class issues at work in the film, The Golden Goose, and also to a certain extent in the tale. The fact that the princess has nothing to laugh about is, I guess, kind of a sorry commentary on aristocratic or royal life. And the king's moral deficiencies and class prejudices are very much on display when he tries to resist allowing the simpleton figure to marry his daughter, despite his decree that any man who can make her laugh can have her hand. Now, in the Grimm's tale, this simpleton figure has to perform 3 impossible feats after he's made the daughter laugh. He first has to find a man who can drink a cellar full of wine, then a man who can eat a mountain of bread, and then a ship that can sail on both land and water. And he's able to accomplish all of these tasks, again with the help of the little old man who gave him the goose. Now, in the film, you'll see that Simpleton is actually given a different task. It differs from the Grimm's tale. In creating fairy tale films, such as The Golden Goose, DEFA sought to imbue its depictions of these tales with socialist values, and thus to convey these values to children, as we've said. The working class is, of course, championed, court life is spurned, and in the DEFA film of The Golden Goose, we see this accentuated with the addition of the negative characters Prince Troublemaker and the very boring Count Wiser Than, characters not in the Grimm's tale. Nevertheless, I'd really like to stress that scholars have often pointed out that DEFA fairy tale films themselves remain treasured film versions of fairy tales, regardless of their ideological background. Class conflict is in any case a very palpable theme in The Golden Goose and many other tales as they appear in the Grimm's collection. So while class struggle might be further amplified in the DEFA films, this struggle is already evident in many of the Grimm's tales. The Grimms themselves believed in the necessity of class distinctions, but they also believed firmly in social mobility through hard work. DEFA fairy tale films are known for their ability both to engage the perspective of children, to tell a tale in a fashion that's genuinely entertaining, but also to engage in social critique. And it's this fusion that has really captivated modern scholars of the DEFA fairy tale films. Screenwriter and film producer Franziska Moletsky said in a recent interview, "My heart goes out when I see a DEFA fairy tale. These tales are colorful, full of love, cheeky, bold, pleasantly simplistic, and just plain magical." As you'll see, though, the film is shot within a studio with painted backdrops and scenes that are supposed to take place outdoors. And we might find some of these scenes rather artificial or fake-looking. The intent, though, in part, was to evoke the illustrations that you might see in a children's book from the 1950s or 60s, with those simplistic backgrounds in the illustrations and the emphasis on the fairy tale character. So you might think of that as you watch the film. Our film tonight was directed by Siegfried Hartmann. And several of the actors in this film also acted in other DEFA films. Hartman did produce other DEFA fairy tale films, for example, one called Snow White and Rose Red, also based on a tale, not the actual Snow White tale, a separate tale called Snow White and Rose Red in the Grimm's collection. I'd like to move now, though, from talking about the East German context to the American kiddie matinee phenomenon of the 1950s and 1960s. The Golden Goose was actually distributed in America, along with several other East German DEFA films in the 1960s by K. Gordon or K.G. Murray, who's regarded as the king of the kiddie matinee. He was also known as the poor man's Walt Disney because of his huge influence on low-budget films, the low-budget film market. He was born in Indiana in 1922, son of a funeral director, and as a boy he grew enamored of circus life. As a teen, he spent most of his free time with circus performers, and because of his experience with circus entertainers, he later assisted with the hiring of midgets to appear as munchkins in The Wizard of Oz. He moved to Hollywood in 1949, but he soon grew disenchanted with it, and after moving to Miami, he founded K. Gordon Murray Productions. Now, this production company bought many low-budget foreign children's films, dubbed them into English, and distributed them for kiddie matinee showings. At first, many of these were Mexican films, but later they also included several of the DEFA fairy tale films. Murray's studio included a dubbing facility, and I deeply regret to say that the film we'll see tonight is dubbed rather than subtitled. I so wish that you could hear the original German and simply read the subtitles. In any case, though, it's interesting to note that the soundtrack you're going to hear isn't actually the K. Gordon Murray soundtrack. It's a bit different. For example, in the Murray dubbing, the youngest son is called Dumbbell. In this one, it's Dimwit. You're going to get very tired of hearing that name. There was also apparently a female narrator in the Murray version. Some differences here. An online reviewer of this film stated, "I prefer the Murray soundtrack, which is more entertaining in that uniquely awful way that made his fairy tale import so memorable." End quote. And many online reviewers of the version you're going to see comment on how much they like the very awful songs. As one notes, "Just so you know it's a Murray picture, there's a really awful song called Butterfly, sung by a red-haired, pig-tailed Gabby village girl." End quote. Another calls the film old-fashioned, slow, but still fun. And one online site quotes a New York Times review that stated, and this is a real doozer, "The Golden Goose is a leaden reenactment of the story of the goose that laid the golden eggs." Actually, it's not, but with a cast of simpering performers and a tired, unhonking goose dyed muddy yellow. End quote. But perhaps this is because this is a goose that has really traveled far and wide. From the Grimms and their storytellers to the East German DEFA studio to the B-rated films of K. Gordon Murray. And part of the magic of fairy tales is that they continue to be retold and refashioned rather than becoming fossilized. These retellings convey the values of their tellers and their times. The bourgeois entrepreneurial spirit of the Grimm's version is this refashioned as socialist ideology in East Germany, or repackaged by the entrepreneurial K. Gordon Murray for an audience of American children. I invite you in any case to sit back, relax, and enjoy the film, The Golden Goose. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have now or after the film. Thanks.
The citizen who makes the darling, very sweet princess laugh will receive the princess to wed, and will inherit half of the kingdom. Ah! What is this? A goose. She's made of gold.
Ow, you're hurting me, blasted goose.
It's quite a goose.
Hey, wait for me. Come, let me off. Wait, I'm stuck. Oh, no, don't tell me. I'm really stuck now.
Come on.
I don't want to.
We're here to get the princess to laugh.
Rabble, you want what? Riffraff. These shabbily dressed women. He's in a nightshirt, farmers, and you brought a wedding party. And also a donkey.
Hey, we're all stuck.
Dude, it's Golden Goose.
Stop now, for the last time. Don't let them through. Go, 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 away from the castle.
6 and 6 and 6 and 6, go sing the song with me.
Triple troubling.
Golden Goose, now we can get free. 6 and 6 and 6 and 6, he's the proper cause. Come and ties the Golden Goose, all along. 6 and 6, Golden Goose, now we can get free. 6 and 6,
Look at the bunny, they're funny.
Why are they all running after our dimwit? And did you see he had a Golden Goose?
Whoever defeats Troublemaker will receive the princess as a wife.
And half the kingdom.
And half of the kingdom. That is the third
Let's
task.
go, men. Huh. You ready to fight, Troublemaker? Ah. Now, my dear prince, you won't bother us anymore. You came to this country by force. Now leave, and take your rowdy men and your ruffians with you.
You are saved.
Now you have to keep your promise, Father. Klaus has fulfilled his 3 tasks.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Klaus. Both of you, be happy.
Sometimes when a young man, youngest son is very often in fairy tales closer to his mother. And so he knows what not to do and what to do, and when to say no and when to say yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. In some of the Grimm's tales, you've got the dwarf as a helper figure or a villain figure, or a helper and villain. Like Rumpelstiltskin is both a helper figure, but also a very dangerous figure too. But a lot of the fairy godmother tales, you have a female hero in the tale. So you have Cinderella or something like that. So yeah, it's interesting why they did change it.
What do you think happened to the Golden Goose? Once everyone did it live happily ever after? Did it go back
sure
to
they all
woman?
lived happily ever after, yeah. And you see here too, the goose kind of becomes secondary at the end, just by the treasure. The king is continuing to count his money. That's all he's really cared about anyway. So the daughter's secondary.
Would the Golden Goose then have replaced the court scholar, Rock of Wisdom guy?
Oh, okay. So this full version that the goose replaced. Yeah, well, could well be. I mean, of course, you don't have these characters in the Grimm's tale either. So this is all added. They've got the Golden Goose, but the purpose of the Golden Goose really is just that, and they've changed kind of the characters who get stuck here, how they get stuck. You don't have the musicians in the Grimm's version, things like that. But the Golden Goose, the purpose is just everything's stuck, and of course this is what makes her laugh, and then the utility of the Golden Goose kind of goes poof beyond that point. Yeah.
Well, an animal is also a symbol of wholeness. So the goose was what was missing from the psyche, right? Yeah. So the silly goose.
Well, could well be, and also, I mean, you have in European folklore, you have so many instances where you have the tree of life, whatever it might be, and you see that here too. They're chopping the tree down, and you've got, it's this life tree that is bearing, further fruits. In this case, it's the Golden Goose. So yeah, I think there's something to that.
Another question. I noticed a few differences between this and besides the old woman and the version we read. Specifically, the absence of the parents, the different tasks, and the changing of the food. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it is interesting because here, I believe, if I heard correctly, in one of the opening scenes, they say, if only our father had lived to see this, you know, what they're, and of course in the Grimm's version, you do have the father. It starts off, there was a man who had 3 sons, and he participates in kind of this rejection of the simpleton character, you know, and branding him as simpleton and things like that. So here you have that, you know, you have that taken out. It's not the father, it's the three sons who are making a living by themselves, with the exploitation of the third one. But they've made those changes. I think with regard to the tasks, I mean, my take on it is just that they tried to emphasize here his having to think for himself, things like that. I mean, in the actual tale, as much as the Grimms really emphasized characters and their cunning and characters, it's not magic itself, it's how the character uses that magic. Nevertheless, in the Golden Goose, as a tale, the feats that he's asked to do, he really does, again, because of this little old gray man. So you don't see as much in those feats themselves, and having to find a man who can drink a cellar full of wine, or find a man who can eat a mountain of bread, things like that. He does this with the help of the little old gray man. So his own agency maybe is taken out of it a little bit more. And here I think they've tried to heighten him thinking, you know, in that line, what's magical about thinking, you know, really kind of brings that home, that this guy's usually, you know, is really using his own resourcefulness. So it amplifies that even more than the Grimms, although that was a value that is very important to the Grimms.
Could one interpret the Golden Goose as a symbolism for dreams? Because everybody wants to touch it, take a feather, and that dreams bring people together, and that, you know, it takes a whole village to bring a wedding together.
Yeah, I mean, in the Grimm's version, and here, so much of it is this greed and the curiosity, and it's a little bit different in this version, but in the Grimm's version, it's the daughter. The first one gets stuck. It's nighttime. She thinks, oh, as soon as he's asleep, I can get a feather. She's really curious about it. She's greedy, and she gets punished for that, as heroines in fairy tales who are curious so often get punished for their curiosity. She's punished. So it's a symbol of, I mean, the Golden Goose itself is a very positive symbol, but the character is wanting to have that gold, that kind of commodification aspect is really punished. There have been some interpretations, not necessarily the Grimm's tale, but of just this whole motif in folklore that have focused on erotic aspects of that and this sticking together and what that might mean. So that's one other interpretation that people have ventured. So,
even as the film version heightens his agency and lets his cleverness direct the solutions, also I think in keeping with maybe the socialist context, he doesn't do it alone. There's that powerful scene where they're all surrounded, you know, all of the stuck people surround Prince Bad News, and he can't get out. And as they're hoisting the chest and as they're defeating the others, everybody's involved.
Yeah.
It's whether he has this charisma that everyone likes him and wants to help, but they're also working together, fixing the pulleys and getting the ropes, and so there's a lot of sort of socialist solidarity.
Absolutely.
In how he defeats.
And just the fact that he is rewarded because he's sharing with the woman and he's helping her to fix her basket and things like that. And that is in the tale, not the basket part, but just that he's the one who shares, if that's what he's rewarded for. One of the DEFA films that I show clips from to my class is actually the DEFA version of Sleeping Beauty, because there's a scene there where they have the, and it's not in the Grimm's version, but the film is based on the Grimm's version, but there's a scene where as they're gathering up all the spinning wheels to burn them, because of course you don't want the dyer to prick her finger on that, there are all these various scenes where the peasants say, you can't take our spinning wheels, this is our livelihood, we won't be able to, you know, provide for our families. And it's all this that you don't have in the actual tale. And I think it's a very it's a scene that I really like to watch, because it's an aspect where it illustrates how they put in these socialist values, but they did so in a way in that scene that really makes sense in terms of the logic of the film. They're adding the logic of the tale. They're adding something that's not actually in the Grimm's tale, but it does fit in quite well with some of these other class tensions that we see in the Grimm's fairy tales. So that's one clip I tend to show my class a lot. But this, what you've pointed out in this film, just that sharing and collaborative spirit, very definitely.
Can you comment on the depiction of the protagonist as a shoemaker?
Well, I would think that, one thing we could say is that in the Grimm's tales, cobblers tend to come out pretty okay. And we've talked in our class about how tailors can be kind of iffy. Tailors are not as positive figures in the Grimm's tales and in some other European traditions as well. They tend to be kind of dubious sometimes, and historically tailors were not as well off as other members of trades. So they're depicted as kind of being looked down on, being trickster figures sometimes. But cobblers tend to be portrayed more positively than that. And we can think of kind of the shoemaker and the elves type of thing.
However, there is a tale in Marie-Louise von Franz's Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales, which is the reverse, where the tailor is very well off and the shoemaker is evil.
Yeah.
So I just want to say it works both ways in this.
Yeah, and that is a good point. I mean, and certainly neither trade would be as lucrative as some of the other trades that we see depicted in the fairy tales, where they seem to be looked on more favorably than the tailors or.
So continue the questioning about the shoemaker part. How many of the actual written tales of this Golden Goose mythology have the main character as a tailor? Or are there other options? Or I remember the one we read, there wasn't really any.
No, and I think that this is a 70-minute long film, and so they're kind of adding some aspects, fleshing it out as any film version of a fairy tale. In the Grimm's version, it's about a 3-page long fairy tale. So of course they're having to add quite a lot to the plot. I'm not sure. I mean, there's so many different variants of this tale, and I'm trying to think of whether I know of any at all where there is overt mention of what that third son does. I mean, from in class when we read The Magic Table, The Golden Donkey, and The Club in the Sack, I mean, there you've got the 3 sons who are depicted, and they all have different trades. The father's a miller, the firstborn son, I think, is a carpenter.
Father's the tailor, the firstborn son becomes
the miller, then the carpenter, and the turner, something like that. Yeah, the father's a tailor there. That's right. And so you've got all these different trades delineated there and depicted, but not in this tale, in the Grimm's version at least. So that's an addition of the tale.
There's always going to be a Cinderella's tale with the shoes and the ugly step of the brothers and the studded up.
Yeah, definitely, and kind of that rags to riches type of theme. And if you think of the shoemaker and the elves, I mean, there too, the shoemaker, very, very poor, but basically a positive figure who's helped by these elves and wants to in turn help the elves that want to make the clothes and things like that. So, yeah.
Was there any controversy over the old woman changing the water to wine, given the puritanical cultures that some of this may have been found in and when it was made?
Well, I think that's kind of an American thing. I mean, in Europe, that's just not an issue. So, yeah, I think that and some of the Little Red Riding Hood retellings for today's audience of school children. In Little Red Riding Hood, in the Grimm's version, she does have a basket, and she's supposed to take wine to her grandmother, and that's the retellings I've seen for children's audience these days, elementary school audience. That's almost always changed to water or something like that. The wine is just taken out because it's not viewed as appropriate to have any alcoholic content, references for school children. So no, I don't think that in itself was a problem at all for the audiences. Now, what the East Germans did tend to do in their fairy tale retellings or in their collections, they actually, when they first published some collections of the Grimm's works, they tended to take out the religious references, and of course the Grimm's themselves, being devout Calvinists, they heightened the religious references in so many of their tales. They added religious references. They added passages where characters would say, "Oh, and God will take care of us," or now we must pray to God, or something like that. So the East Germans took that out. They also took out some of the violence, and they took out any racist elements of the tales. So those were kind of the things that the East Germans would sanitize. But I don't think that the wine would bother an audience of East Germans, West Germans, at all in the post-war or now. It's just more of an accepted thing. So
I have two questions. Two details that puzzle me. The first is the cartoon at the beginning that establishes the connection between the Golden Goose and the sun and makes it the solar god.
Right.
Which of course raises a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Another, I don't know how to put it, I would say homophobic overturns in the depiction, at least of one brothers. It's a very,
with the
it's very
misfits.
obvious, yeah.
With the misfit.
He's obviously gay, and there's no question about it. And he's depicted in a homophobic way. So was it part of the just improvisation, or was it some kind of...
Gee, that's a really good question. I don't think I have an answer to that. Other than that, I think it is very interesting in the retelling, this film retelling, that you have not just the third brother who is somehow different, but the second brother as well, and that constant, the misfit point. And only at the very end do we have the oldest brother who's referring to him by name. All the way through, it's been misfit, and the youngest, dimwit or dumbbell or whatever it is, depending on the soundtrack. So yeah, I haven't considered that aspect of it at all. But,
I think it's very obvious.
As for the sun and the goose, yeah, it's interesting though, because you've got that at the beginning in the cartoon. It's not necessarily carried out in the. I mean, you do have, in terms of just color imagery, you've got the gold that's being counted all the times. You've got the very Halloweenish, black and orange costumes that the aristocracy and the guards are wearing. But yeah, what do you think about that? Because it's not really.
The fire
is
also a symbol of good.
Yeah, it is.
It also leads to the bride, and so it's sort of
it's valuable and rare.
Right. And in not all of the European versions, I'm not familiar with the Slavic versions. I know that they exist, but I'm not actually familiar with them. I don't think in all the versions where you have the sticky animal, is it gold? I think it can really vary whether it is actually, and I think in the English versions it's actually just a clay pot. In some of the English versions.
Well, in one of the Russian ones, it's a goose that you can cook and eat, and then you throw the bones on the floor and it comes back to life. And then it has to do with exposing an affair, right? The guy brings it home, and his wife takes it and then gets stuck to it, and her lover has to free her, and that's how.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
But pagan gods coming back.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, just with that, the solar, I mean, and you can also think back, the time that this is being filmed, you do have, from the 19th century on, but you have these theories of fairy tales as having originated in solar mythology and things like that. So it is possible that they're trying to make a connection with that. Could very well be. It's just curious that it doesn't seem to be really followed through that much in the...
And they're forgetting silver shoes as well.
Yeah.
There is dancing, but there's no shoes.
Yeah, you would have expected Klaus to actually show that he can nail the heel on, but it doesn't happen. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Julie?
I was thinking the brothers scene actually quite happy dancing with the innkeeper's daughters.
Except for the home. He ducks the kid.
Happy ending. Right. Yeah.
And the misfit is happy dancing with a girl.
Yes. So maybe the improv doesn't actually. Yeah. All right. Great. Thank you so much.